timely panel discussion titled What's Next for Afghanistan Amid Taliban's Rise and U.S. Withdrawal. My name is Yunus Angyabadi, and I'm the Executive Vice President of the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. Let me briefly talk about our institute before I introduce our great moderator who will be leading and moderating the discussion today. The Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, or IPD, is a nonpartisan foreign policy think tank dedicated to promoting and amplifying innovative thinking in North Atlantic foreign policy. We stand for dialogue, diplomacy, prudent realism, and restraint principles, which we believe are the four cornerstones of sustainable peace in an increasingly complex and dynamic international system. The discussion today will be recorded and later published on our website and YouTube channel. If you still haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, I'd like to urge you to do so that you will be kept updated about our upcoming events. As we all know, the month of August was full of unexpected events with the Taliban's rapid takeover of Afghanistan, except Panjshir province, which still remains out of the group's control. Despite 20 years of Western aid and more than $80 billion of training and support for the Afghan military from the United States, Afghanistan's well-equipped security forces collapsed and the US-backed Afghan government fell so quickly that it contradicted President Biden's earlier statement on July 8, where he said that the Afghan government was unlikely to fall and there would be no chaotic evacuations of Americans similar to the end of Vietnam War, which obviously wasn't the case. Here in Canada, we were also informed that Ambassador of Afghanistan, Hassan Surush, who had confirmed to give a keynote address, could no longer join us today due to recent developments in the country. To uncover these developments and discuss the future of Afghanistan, we're honored to have Shelley Kittleson, who will be moderating the discussion with four distinguished experts joining us from Washington and Ottawa. Without further ado, let me now introduce our moderator. Shelley Kittleson is an award-winning journalist who has reported from the ground across the Middle East and Afghanistan for the past decade. She has filed dispatches from multiple front lines against the Islamic State in Iraq and such difficult to access locations as the position held Syria, tribal areas on both sides of the Iraqi-Syrian border, and Taliban besieged Kandahar for publications including Al Monitor, Foreign Policy, New Lines, Politico, and Vogue. With that, I would like to hand over the floor to Shelley. Go ahead, Shelley, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. I would like to introduce the panelists to begin with. The first one will be Dr. William Ruger, Vice President for Research and Policy at the Charles Koch Institute and Vice President for Foreign Policy at Stand Together. He is also a veteran of the Afghanistan War, and I believe he will be speaking a bit more about that. Our second panelist will be Dr. Max Abrams, a fellow at the Quincy Institute, professor of political science at Northeastern University, and author of the book Rules for Rebels, The Science of Victory in Militant History. Then we will have Dr. Nila Far-Sakhi, Director of Policy and Diplomacy at the McColm and Company, and she is an Afghan from Herat, and we are looking forward to hearing from her. And then also Dr. Nipa Banerjee, Senior Fellow at the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa. She served 33 years in the former Canadian International Development Agency and was the head of the Canadian government's aid program in Afghanistan from 2003 to 2006. So first of all, we'd like to hear some opening remarks from Dr. Ruger, and then we'll have some questions for him. Okay. So if I could hand it over to him then.
Great, thank you. And I'm happy to be here with all of you. So I think that one of the most important things to do amidst the obviously, concerning situation in Kabul, which we all have sympathies for the people who are stuck in a very difficult situation, is I think we still need to go back when we think about US policy and separate the withdrawal decision from the challenges of the evacuation. And so I do think that it's still important to harken back to, why it made sense. Because sometimes the implementation of a policy can make people question, whether we should have done it in the first place. And I still think that the appropriate response to meet U.S. national interests was to leave the war and to end America's longest war. And so I'll talk about that just for a minute. So, why do we go to Afghanistan? what was required of the United States in Afghanistan after 9/11. And I think there we needed to do three things. We needed to punish the Taliban for its state sponsorship of Al-Qaeda. Two, we needed to decimate Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And three, we needed to kill or capture Osama bin Laden as one of the chief architects of the attack. And I think we achieved those goals long before even last year and this year. And so our national interest didn't require us to do what happened, which was we expanded the war aims well beyond what was achievable and well beyond what was required for the national interest. So the status of human rights in, say, Helmand province is clearly something that any good, I think, liberal, classical, or otherwise would favor. But it wasn't necessary for America's national security interests or the conditions of its prosperity, or even the status of our liberal democracy here at home. And so those were nice to haves as opposed to need to have, and not things that were worth the kind of bloody and treasure draining sacrifices that were made. And so since we had accomplished those goals long before now, the United States could safely extricate itself from the conflict. And that's because our national interests in Afghanistan are very limited. The only thing that really the United States needs from Afghanistan is that it's not a place where terrorists with the intent and capability to harm the United States can operate with impunity. And the way to accomplish that national interest doesn't require a permanent military presence there. We could use over-the-horizon capabilities. We could use special operations forces. We could even use punitive raids as necessary, as Gil Barndollar talked about recently in the Wall Street Journal. So there are ways in which we could satisfy those interests short of sustaining America's longest war. The other thing is that the alternatives were worse. Especially given the Doha Agreement, if the United States had flaked on that agreement, then the United States would have faced a renewal and a heightening of American combat or combat involving Americans. And so one of the things that I found quite disheartening about the conversation, particularly in Washington, is the argument that there was some stable equilibrium, that all we had to do is have 2,500 troops in the country, and that we could have stayed there indefinitely with no Americans dying and at minimal cost. The fact is that there was no stable equilibrium. The United States, even advocates of the conflict, in the establishment, understood and had talked about how, we were losing slowly, that the Taliban had operational and tactical momentum. And so the idea that we could have stayed is again, I think, a bad faith one. And so the reality is that we would have had to consider whether Trump's withdrawal would have been better or worse than Biden's war. And I think President Biden rightly concluded that continuing with the withdrawal, not consistent fully with the Doha Agreement, because obviously we missed the deadline, but essentially in harmony, I think, with the Doha Agreement, was the best thing to do for the United States. And I think the rapid collapse of the Afghan government has only shown that essentially the Afghan state had no legitimacy or limited legitimacy. It was racked by corruption. It was racked by ineffectiveness. And it could not maintain the legitimacy that is required of a nation state to have people willing to fight and die for it. And again, I think that the Afghan people, and again, it's hard to talk about any people in blunt terms, but I think in general, I think that there was a real desire in the Afghan people for something different than the decades of conflict. And sometimes I think American audiences are a little bit obtuse here in forgetting the fact that the bloodshed in Afghanistan was ongoing even after Americans were not being targeted by the Taliban. There was still major amounts of death and destruction around the country. And so even though Kabul may have been somewhat safe relative to other places. The fact is that there was a lot of problems around the country, a lot of fighting, and a lot of people being caught in the crossfire. And a lot of Afghans, I think, simply wanted to have the chance for a more peaceful future, even if that meant, not being able to realize the full ideals of what had probably been hoped for over a decade ago. The other thing I'd mention before we move on is that the American public supports the decision. Multiple polls have confirmed this. It was approaching 70% before the evacuation, but it still maintained a majority of support even after some of the devastating scenes we've unfortunately witnessed. And so I think the American public understands that and has a kind of realism about the future. And it's easy to Monday morning quarterback the evacuation, but I think it's too early to tell and to provide a final assessment. Obviously, things could have been done better, but that's something that's always could be said and is a non-falsifiable claim, right? And I think it's important to try to do better at evacuating people that we have a responsibility to evacuate, particularly Americans. But let's not, I think, overly Monday morning quarterback this until we see more about how things actually turned out. But again, this withdrawal decision was the right one. It's good for America's national interests. And I hope to see that the future of Afghanistan determined by Afghans, and hopefully it will be a better one than we've seen over the last 40 years.
Great. I'm actually going to move on to the next panelist for his opening remarks, but could I just ask each of the panelists at the end, how long were you in Afghanistan? And if so, when exactly, if I could? When was the last time you were in Afghanistan?
Yeah, just real quick for me, I was there in 2008, 2009. I was in uniform at that time. So that was the last time I was there. And mostly time in Kabul, but also in RC South, or at that time, what was RC South?
What was RC South for the audience?
Regional Command South was how ISAF broke up the country into regional commands. And this was Helmand, Kandahar, Zabul, Nimruz, Daikundi, and Uruzgan.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. Now we're going to move on to Max Abrams, and we'll come back later to more questions. Okay, if that's okay with you guys. Okay. Okay.
Great. So I come at this from a different perspective. Somebody who studies militant group dynamics. I'm interested not just in the Taliban, but I've studied hundreds of militant groups. And so what I'd like to do is provide a little bit of context. And specifically, I'd like to address the question of why the Taliban has been so successful. There's no dispute that the Taliban has been successful. It literally took 1 week from August 9 to 16 for the Taliban to take the first province and then the last one in Kabul. Where there isn't a consensus, though, is on the question as to why. There's been a whole lot of loose talk on this question, and it looks something like this. It's a real mess, I'm sure, for those following. CNN blamed the Afghan military, quote, although Afghan security forces were well-funded and well-equipped, they put up little resistance as Taliban militants seized much of the country following the U.S. withdrawal in July. The Diplomat has blamed President Ghani and other Afghan officials for their corruption, which destroyed their legitimacy. Mark Esper, the former Trump defense secretary, he blamed his old boss for wanting to withdraw American forces out of Afghanistan. Trump has blamed Biden, saying that he should resign in disgrace. Fox News has repeated this. Wall Street Journal has blamed both American officials and Afghan officials. And so this isn't cherry picking. These are widespread views. There was a very recent CBS poll over the past week. The question is, who deserves the most blame for the Taliban taking over? Among Americans, 60% blame the Afghan government, 55% blame the Afghan army, 36% blame Biden, 25% blame Trump. You guys are probably familiar with the expression which was articulated. He didn't come up with it, by Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs, saying victory has 100 fathers, but defeat is an orphan. And yet there seems to be a conspicuous absence here in terms of this question of, why is the Taliban so successful? And I think to a large extent, the answer has to do with the Taliban itself, and not just all of these other parties. It's not just the Afghan government, the military, U.S. decision making. What I've done in most of my academic career is look at the fact that there's wide variation in the political successes of militant groups. Some militants are very successful. For example, Hezbollah kicked America and the French out of southern Lebanon in the early 80s. The Armed Islamic Group of Algeria, by contrast, a decade later, is generally seen as a failure in terms of creating some sort of a caliphate in Algeria. And so what explains these differences in their success? And looking at hundreds of groups, what I've boiled it down to is that the more successful militant groups, at least at the leadership level, they tend to do three very important things. First, they recognize that not all violence is equal, that indeed some kinds of violence is actually politically counterproductive. Specifically, indiscriminate violence against civilian targets tends to be folly when it comes to coercing governments into making concessions. But it's not enough for the leadership to understand that there's variation in the quality of violence. They need to actually try to impose their tactical preferences on the rank and file. And so they need to have some control over the kinds of targets that their fighters strike. And third, even when the leadership does engage in 1 and 2, it's almost inevitable in any large group that some militants will defy the leadership's preferences and attack civilian targets, in which case the leadership needs to not brag about that violence against civilians, but rather try to distance the organization from them in order to preserve this impression that the group is at least somewhat restrained. The Taliban has actually done a surprisingly good job in following what I call the rules for rebels. Now, this might come as a big surprise to people because the Taliban is known as such an extreme group, and of course does have a lot of blood on its hands, including against civilian targets. But what will surprise a lot of people is that I'm going to read you some statements from the leadership in terms of the code of conduct that goes back over 15 years. The Mujahideen has to take every step to protect the lives and wealth of ordinary people. Anyone who has killed civilians during the jihad may not be accepted into the Taliban movement. Taliban foot soldiers must at all costs avoid civilian casualties. The Taliban bans cutting off noses, lips, and ears off of ordinary people. The Mujahideen must have a good relationship with the tribal community and with the local people. In carrying out martyrdom operations, take great efforts to avoid casualties among the common people. Take care of public property and the lives of the people. So my point is, I have pages and pages of this, basically a book of this, where the leadership for many, many, many years has actually understood that civilian casualties are risky and has urged lower level members not to commit them. What I've found, though, is that when the Taliban does strike civilian targets, that tends to be not at the behest of the leadership, but very often when there's an absence of leadership control. For example, in one study, I'm able to show statistically that civilian attacks by the Taliban go up substantially in the immediate aftermath of an operationally successful targeted killing against the leadership. And this is because lower level members in the rank disproportionately account for this kind of politically suboptimal violence against civilians. And when these kinds of civilian attacks do tend to happen, the Taliban doesn't react the way the Islamic State leadership did. It doesn't brag about them. It tends to engage in what I call denial of organizational involvement. So very often coders of attacks know whether the Taliban committed the attack or not. But when the attack is against a civilian target, what I find with my co-author Justin Conrad in one of our studies is that the Taliban is significantly less likely to claim credit for these kinds of anti-civilian attacks. And furthermore, their propaganda videos are significantly less likely to feature civilian attacks than the actual targeting patterns of the organization. And so I think to a large extent, what commentators have overlooked is what the Taliban has done right. And this is very different, for example, than the Islamic State group, where the leadership said, just attack absolutely anything. It intentionally empowered operatives all over the world, often lone wolves. And when civilian attacks were committed, of course, they bragged about it, like the Jihadi John beheading videos. I think that there are a lot of implications in terms of the future of the Taliban. A lot of people want to know, is the Taliban for real? Or is this just some kind of a new PR campaign? Well, it's not a new PR campaign. The Taliban leadership has been saying this stuff for a very long time. And the reason why the leadership has been saying this is not I'm not some sort of a Taliban apologist here. It's not because there's some kind of a moral group. It's because they're a strategic group. And they understand that it's actually in their interest to at least present this patina of moderation. And when we do see attacks, bloodletting against minorities and civilians, I would predict, based on my research, that very often it will be due not to the preferences of the leadership, but of a loss of principal control. That historically has been the Taliban's behavioral pattern. So I have much more to say, but I'll just stop there.
I understand. No, very interesting. We will get back to you later with some questions. Just to be clear for the audience, have you ever been to Afghanistan?
No.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. And then we'll move on to our only Afghan panelist here. So Dr. Nila Far-Sakhi, I will let you give your opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Shelley, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, depending on from where you are joining us. And I would like to thank the Institute of Peace and Diplomacy for having me over here. Well, it has been a shocking week for most of us who are closely following the recent processes. We don't want to go back so much to the century, but just the last 2.5 years of the processes. I name it as a peace process, some refer it as a political process, some refer it as a U.S. withdrawal process. So I would like to reflect on that, though I wanted to really talk about last 1 week and now the last week, 1 week of crisis, what crisis exists right now, and what opportunities exist also moving forward, which includes humanitarian crisis, Taliban's legitimacy crisis, and the regional aspect, the regional issues in Afghanistan. So I will leave that aside and get back to it during question and answer session. But let me talk a little bit about the background of this process and what went wrong from my lens. I saw and closely followed this entire process since September, October 2018 till now. And I'm talking from peacemaking perspective, by the way. I have been looking at all the peacemaking processes in major parts of the world, and then looking at doing comparative analysis and what went wrong, what made Taliban so powerful and successful that we are arguing today. So I think I divided initially this entire phase into 3 phases. So the first was, of course, the negotiation between the United States and the Taliban, which ended up in Doha Agreement. The second was intra-Afghan talks, which was the second phase. And the third component and phase which I added to the process was a regional component, which all 3 phases at some point went side by side. Now, what went wrong? Well, in all the peacemaking processes at the negotiation table, you never empower one party. That is a flaw of the process. When one party is empowered and the other party is disempowered, you will never expect a concrete or a political settlement result. In many cases, I'm not saying in all, but in many cases of peacemaking, that showed. So what happened at the Doha deal, that the Doha process overall, that empowered Taliban. And why, how? I mean, it did not exert a lot of pressure on them. Taliban, whatever conditions were at the table of negotiation, like release of detainees, like many other aspects that the negotiations were going on. So a lot of platform was given to the Taliban in order to move forward, in order to make the process move forward, without paying attention to the other parties who were involved in the negotiation table, which certainly, obviously, the government of Afghanistan was part of it. So the graph shows that Taliban used violence as a tool to exert more pressure at the negotiation table. And soon after the Doha deal was signed, we saw the number of targeted attacks went up. We saw also the number of attacks increase throughout the country, and we saw more organization of the Taliban at the battlefield. And that was soon after the Doha agreement was signed. And it is in many cases, and in many cases around the world, in Colombia, or many cases that Bosnia that you will see, that happens if one party sees itself from a position of power. So I think I would, if we see conceptually this entire process, the Doha agreement was one of the fastest step for the Taliban to be more organized at the battlefield, and also to not be willing to compromise at any level. So I think that is one thing. And that's an external factor, by the way, that I would refer to the success of the Taliban and their rapid takeover of the major provinces, including then Kabul. The internal element, I think William also referred to that, is the inefficiency of Afghan government, of the Republic in general. I mean, let me put Afghan government, I don't want to put blame on the Republic, but Afghan government. The inefficiency of Afghan governments, not only President Ghani's, ex-president, former President Ashraf Ghani, but also former President Hamid Karzai. So the two administrations were not able to extend their influence at the rural population. And as we all know, 75% of the population in Afghanistan are rural. So they were unable to extend the services, put a better governance system in place. And Taliban did claim over time from 2003 onwards that they had a shadow government in place in many of those rural areas. So meanwhile, the government inefficiency give a lot of platform to the Taliban to expand their influence in all those rural areas and gain more support and legitimacy from those rural areas. So that is the internal factor which gradually led to Taliban takeover in some major districts. When they initially started their fight, they claimed that majority of the districts, especially southeast and some even in the north, some in the west, the people did not resist. And initially, I'm talking about the initial, then the resistance started afterward. So I think that goes back to the inefficiency of the government, two governments in Afghanistan from the last 20 years, where they were not able to put in place a better governance system there to satisfy the population, provide services, and gain more legitimacy throughout the country. So these are the internal factor and external factor, which is the political processes that started from last 2.5 years that added to the rapid takeover of the Taliban. Well, the takeover was rapid, but no one was expecting it could be this way. Why? Because people like us who were closely following this entire process from October 2018, we were hoping and we were thinking, based on how the process were moving, that The withdrawal, as William mentioned, hasn't been a big issue. The withdrawal was always there. Even during President Obama, there was a deadline set forward, which we did not. And then, and every administration, there was an issue of withdrawal. There was talks about controversies about withdrawal and talks about the deadlines too. So that by itself, by essence, the concept of withdrawal is not an issue. The issue that many of us have been actually analyzing, it was the conditionality element, that many refer to it as a not really put forward and strictly. So what was framed that it would be a conditional withdrawal with certain conditions to whoever will be in the government, right? There was not much about the collapse of the republic. There was more about collapse of a system, of a government of Afghanistan, not collapse of a system. So everyone was kind of hoping inside Afghanistan as well that the government is okay if it's gonna collapse, or people are kind of expecting that, right? But not the collapse of a republic. That was shocking for everyone. That means starting everything from the scratch. That means all the last 20 years of money and life that invested in Afghanistan, that was in vain. So that means a lot of other issues which underlies that. So therefore, what was kind of hoped initially inside Afghanistan and outside as well, that the process will end up creating a political settlement, end up in kind of a political settlement in the presence of US troops in Afghanistan. So that would help the collapse of the country overall. That would help the prevention of humanitarian crisis or another political disaster. So that would help if it would go gradually and there was a kind of a settlement where an inclusive government or whatever shape the parties would engage with, that would come up. And some were hoping that President Ghani would resign, and then the process would happen. So there were all kind of analysis and expectations from Afghans and outsider also that actually this process did not meet the ongoing process, and which created a lot of chaos, frustration inside the country among different sectors of the society. I stop here and then I'll continue the rest during the session.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And next up will be Dr. Nipa Banerjee. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, who has spent a significant amount of time in the country. And yeah, if you'd like to give your opening remarks, we'd love to hear them. Hello? Unmute your, if you could, yeah,
yes,
great.
Sorry about that. You want me to speak about my time in the country, you said?
Yes, in general, and what you think of the situation now, and then we'll go on to other questions.
Okay. Well, I was representative of the Canadian government at the Canadian Embassy between 2003 to 2006. I was the head of Canada's aid program. And since I came back, I've traveled there several times. I would travel about twice a year up to 2018, but the situation was getting so insecure that I didn't travel since then. But that's Afghanistan is my research focus, and I continue to work on the country. This morning, I will present my views and analysis of issues in 3 areas of the Afghanistan crisis. A, American administration's responsibility for the crisis and its handling. B, consequences of isolating the Taliban by not recognizing the regime and the Canadian Prime Minister's threat to the Taliban that they would face consequences if the evacuation process was disrupted. C, the Taliban pledge to install progressive governance, a change from the way the Taliban ruled 20 years ago. The crisis has resulted from the inevitable and yet unplanned and too quick a withdrawal of the US forces that caught Afghanistan and the international community by surprise. The unexpectedly rapid advances of the Taliban and the quick fall of Kabul resulted in the crisis at the Kabul airport, threatening the lives of Afghans trying to escape. I argue that the withdrawal was inevitable and could not have been ultimately avoided, as no country can live indefinitely with foreign troops protecting the population. However, too quick a withdrawal without proper planning, especially an appropriate plan for evacuation of civilians, was bound to result in a crisis we witness today. Yet, I would say that the fall of Kabul has been in the making for over at least the last 15 years. The indicators of a strengthening insurgency clearly reflected in the gradual but steady advances of the Taliban in the rural areas and districts were ignored, not only by the US, but by the international community. The fact that NATO's mission to train, advise, and assist the Afghan army was failing was quite evident in the exposition of increasing Taliban control of the Afghan territory published in the Long War Journal, an American publication. However, that the Afghan military was losing was not acknowledged by the leadership. The Afghanistan Papers, A Secret History of the War, documents these truths. US officials consistently said they were making progress, but unfortunately they were not, and they knew it. An exclusive Washington Post investigation found. Confidential government documents obtained by the Washington Post reveals that senior US officials failed to tell the truth about the war in Afghanistan for at least 15 years, making rosy pronouncements they knew to be false and hiding unmistakable evidence that the war had become unwinnable. With respect to the threat issued to the Taliban by the Canadian PM, it is hard to fathom how a threat could be used to tame the Taliban. Do we have the capacity to deal with the militants? What leverages could be used? Would stopping foreign aid to Afghanistan work? That is a leverage, the latter, that is stopping foreign aid, is a leverage that can be used for negotiating with the Taliban in the longer term. But for the immediate term, for instance, facilitating a quick and safe evacuation process, the leverage of retracting foreign aid will not be effective. A strategy must be developed for immediate use to guide international, including Canadian policies and actions that is useful for the immediate term. I now present my thoughts on Taliban pledges to adopt a progressive governance style and its claims to be a group different from the one that ruled 20 years ago. The press conference in Kabul attended by the Taliban is an indicator of a changed Taliban, and it is also the most outstanding achievement of the international community in 20 years. The trustworthiness of the Taliban continues to be questioned. I say that we may continue to see contradictions between the words and actions of the Taliban because the Taliban is ununited, and the rank and file of the Taliban do not necessarily agree with the leadership. Afghans I speak to almost every day, and I did that this morning as well. They say that the situation is not as desperate and dangerous in the city. People are out in the streets to purchase everyday supplies while they are not stopped and return home safely. They witnessed some guys stopped and questioned. They are counted as rogue elements in the Taliban group. Apparently, some of them have been arrested now by orders of the Taliban political leaders. Well, I mean, the authenticity of these things have to be confirmed, but these are young Afghans who are talking about these issues. I cannot serve as a guarantor of Taliban trustworthiness, but with no other options at the table, we have to put some faith in Taliban leaders' pledges. I want to take a positive view as I see no feasible alternative. Remobilization of troops to restrain the Taliban is not an option. The solution must be political and not military, as the 20 years of war has proved. Isolation of the Taliban by the international community will mostly harm the Afghans, as they will be cut off from the outside world with no oversight or surveillance of the Taliban territory by the international community. I would conclude with the words that a hasty and thus an unplanned withdrawal is definitely behind the chaotic and dangerous situation created today. A well-planned, gradual, and negotiated exit involving the regional powers and the Western allies would turn out better results. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'm going to be asking some questions of each of you, not in any particular order, but I will start with Nila Far, okay? We've just heard from Nipa that many Afghans have contacted her and said that it's not as bad as we're hearing in the West. I haven't been hearing that from the Afghans that I've spoken to. I was wondering what you've been hearing as an Afghan, obviously.
Well, yeah, I haven't been hearing that too, Shelley. I have been on calls from colleagues who I worked in the past in Afghanistan, with friends who are still there, and with my students who I taught at the American University of Afghanistan, with many actually, and all of them are in a very state of fear, frustration. Some are crying on the phones, and there's nothing really happening in particular. But the fear of having not a good life, or being threatened, or being killed, or their family members are being killed, that fear has made everyone to rush to the airport. And they are asking, not only me, we are in contact with many here also in the US, they are asking many of us just to do something, take us out, put our names on the list, and include us in the evacuation plan. And that's what I have been hearing from last Sunday and Monday.
Yeah, no, I've got dozens of messages of people saying things that they're desperate, that they need to get out, and I don't know how to help. But yeah, so going then back to Will, let's ask some questions of him possibly. In response to critics who argue that the Taliban might again allow Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations to use Afghanistan as a springboard for launching attacks against the West, you have asserted previously that the Taliban will not take such a risk, aware of how the US responded after 9/11. If the Taliban once again becomes a safe haven for extremist groups, how should the US react? And do we have the capability at this point to conduct counterterrorism operations in that country if needed without being physically present?
Yeah, so I think what I said is that the Taliban has an incentive and an interest in not allowing Afghanistan to be used as a base of operations for terrorist groups with the intent and capability to hit the United States homeland in particular, and our troops abroad, as long as they're not in Afghanistan. And I think I can kind of unpack that a little bit, which is that, despite the fact that the Taliban is obviously riding a bit high this week, the fact is that the United States and the coalition severely punished the Taliban over the last 20 years. And it will not be lost on the Taliban that they lost thousands and thousands of insurgent forces. Leadership was continually targeted, oftentimes killed. And I think that given that, and the fact that the Taliban was pushed out of government for the last 20 years. And I think that, the Taliban as a state actor, right, when it fully forms a new state, the Taliban government would want to maintain its grip on power, and one of the best ways to avoid losing that grip on power is not having an external country with the military capabilities of the United States to depose it and to re-engage in the process of targeting their leadership. So I think they have an incentive there, and also I think that the question, and Max may be able to be able to say something about this, is really the question of how connected is the Taliban, particularly throughout the ranks, to the internationalization of jihad that Zawahiri and Osama bin Laden, how they had directed Al-Qaeda. And I think that my guess is that the Taliban has more incentive in trying to maintain its power and its ability to kind of govern in the way they see fit in Afghanistan than worrying about some of the concerns that Zawahiri and bin Laden had. And I think some of the evidence of this is the fact that, in a variety of books on the bin Ladens, including, I think, in the Looming Tower, there's a discussion of fact that the Taliban government really considered, quite seriously handing bin Laden over to the Saudis before 9/11. And so the relationship between those two groups is not as kind of tight as one might think, given the kind of convenience on some margins that we've seen over the last 20 years. So I think that there are some incentives there. Now, in terms of how we might handle, like I said, like you asked, those groups that might emerge, again, I think the United States has great over the horizon capability. The United States also has proven effective in other parts of the globe at reaching out and striking terrorist organizations without needing to have a permanent military garrison. I think one of the reasons why you're seeing criticism of the Afghan withdrawal is actually less about the prospect of these so-called safe havens or vacuums, and more to have to do, I think, with the fact that withdrawing from Afghanistan challenges the kind of underpinnings of the primacist approach to the Middle East and to U.S. grand strategy more generally. And so, and we could talk about this a little bit later, a little more later, but the fact is that retrenching from a forward theater of operations like this is not to be tolerated if you have the view that the United States needs to be leading and needs to be actively deployed and remaking the nature of what are believed to be hostile areas. And I think that that's why this debate has been so, I think, heated, is because the architects of primacy, the architects of our effort to try to remake the Middle East, see it for what it is, which is a strike at the heart of that approach to the world.
Do you think that the US intelligence community and the military ever really understood the relations between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban?
I would just probably broaden that out to say, what have we, in the West, and particularly in the United States in general, understood about the Taliban. And there I would say that there were a lot of challenges for us to understand the Afghanistan conflict and Afghan society from the get-go. Part of that is that Afghanistan has not been a strategically significant part of the world for the United States. It remains a kind of tertiary theater. It's not to say that it's not important. It's very important to Afghans and very important to its regional neighbors. But in terms of a country that's that far away, that isn't at a kind of strategic crossroads really for the United States, and it's not like the Straits of Malacca or any of the other kind of strategic choke points around the world, or a modern industrialized country with a strong economy like Germany or Japan, right? It's a relatively minor player in the on the economic scene. And so there hasn't been a lot of focus on this traditionally, and so the United States hasn't had the kind of I think cultural literacy, language capabilities, and real knowledge of the kind of internal politics of Afghanistan that would allow for, I think, the Washington foreign policy community to have the kind of discussions and understandings that would be necessary for us to have an appropriate national conversation about this. Clearly the U.S. Government had developed over 20 years greater knowledge, but again, someone once said, how could we get right the politics of foreign countries as an establishment when the establishment didn't even get right the 2016 election in our own country, right? People were surprised by the strength of Donald Trump and his winning the election, right? Heck, there were even people in the Trump administration surprised perhaps by his victory in November of 2016. How could we expect to understand all the politics of a place as complicated as Afghanistan if we couldn't understand the politics of the upper Midwest and how that went very differently than what people expected? And so I think that it's a kind of fundamental knowledge problem that we have in international politics, period, that we also have in domestic politics. Not only because of things like mirror imaging, but also because the world is a complicated and nuanced place, and having a kind of deep understanding of those things is difficult. It's why I'm a conservative in more than just foreign policy. I think it's really difficult for Washington to understand the best way to, for example, to have welfare policy in Washington State or Florida or Maine, because it's very difficult to have top-down kind of comprehensive solutions to problems that are complicated. It makes it even harder when it's thousands of miles away, a country we hardly understand, and a culture that's very rich, nuanced, and complicated.
Absolutely. Okay, when I was in Kandahar recently, I was there earlier this month at the very beginning of August. I heard from several people that they felt like America had actually helped the Taliban by ordering the release in some way of 5,000 Taliban detainees as part of the deal made in 2020. And there was also an article in the Washington Post, I believe in late, maybe October of 2020, that said that the US had helped the Taliban in some way with drone strikes against the Islamic State Khorasan province. How would you respond to Afghans that say, why did the US suddenly start helping the Taliban?
I guess what I would say about Doha at all is that diplomacy is the art of the possible, not the art of the ideal, or the science of the ideal. And what that means is that the balance of power, particularly the local balance of power, the conditions on the ground, the constraints that one faces, and the difficulties that the United States had, meant that we did not have a hand flush with great cards. And so I think what Ambassador Khalilzad was able to do at Doha was to provide a satisficing kind of deal, right? It was enough that we could live with it. We didn't get everything I think we wanted, but I thought we got what we needed. And there had to be some compromises there, because again, one of the problems I think is that with the way the Washington rules approach to foreign policy is that it is a kind of immaturity about the fact that diplomacy requires A, talking to your enemies, and B, having to make compromises with them if you're going to achieve your interests, and that everything doesn't end up looking like the 1945, when your opponents are utterly devastated and unconditionally surrender. That's just not traditionally how the world has worked. And that means that things are going to be messier than we would like. There's not going to be some moment in Times Square where you're celebrating an absolute victory. And the other thing is that it's not even rational to desire that, because we fight limited wars where we have limited interests with limited means. And so not everything is going to look like that. And I think the American approach to war has largely been impacted by the good war, the Great War approach, in a way that is induced, I think, some immaturity in how we look at how wars actually end most of the time in history, including in our history. If you think about the end of the Korean War, the end of the Vietnam War, those were different. And heck, even the end of the Gulf War was not something where you had the kind of absolute victory that we ended the war early because we believed it was in our interest to do so and didn't insist on a maximal approach. So I think that the Doha Agreement showed some maturity.
Okay. Would anyone else want to respond to that, or?
Well, I want to add to this knowledge problem that William highlights. I think that has been a serious issue. The knowledge problem has been even in the diplomatic efforts and exclusion of Taliban since the beginning. I mean, since the beginning means 20 years back when the Bonn Agreement was signed. So that started actually an issue when you sideline a group that has its influence in different parts of the country. And the other knowledge problem, which I think I can talk about that, is that there has been so much focus on individuals from last 20 years and building individuals, funding individuals, building the capacity of them. Individuals means the leaders, and Afghan society is a collective society, and there has been less focus on the collective version of how to help the collectivity of society to move forward together and build a nation. Though there are arguments in the recent conversations that the United States was not there for nation building or state building, but there are many related activities and programs around the country that demonstrate some of those nation building or state building efforts that was supported by the United States. Though the claim is there that the US was not there for the nation or state building. So those programs also encounter issues of lack of knowledge. And the design of those programs were not based on understanding the complex culture of society, of not addressing actually the problems of those 75% of the population who were there, of not working even with those 75% of the population who are considered rulers. So there was the knowledge problem or cross-cutting issue, has been a cross-cutting issue, and diplomacy and development funding, and also both of the nation building and state building that some refer to it. I think that has remained there, and considering Afghanistan's complex tradition, culture, and the issues of identity at some point, that makes actually the strategist or the builders of a strategy to think based on the needs of the ground rather than cut and paste models from different other contexts.
Max, maybe? Well, actually, could I ask a specific question?
Yeah, I would love to get in on some of the questions Will got just about, I mean, of course, the reason why we got into Afghanistan mainly is for counterterrorism. So, it's really a very important question, is how will our withdrawing affect our safety from the terrorism threat? I agree with what Will said there in terms of assuming that the Taliban is an essentially rational actor. I think that there's been a consistent tendency to underestimate the Taliban, but they're not stupid at the leadership level. They understand that the reason why we came to Afghanistan and why we occupied their country, contrary to their wishes, and why we killed so many of them, is because they were implicated in 9/11, at least in some indirect way, as hosts. There's a convergence of interest between the United States and the Taliban. The Taliban doesn't want us in their country, and we don't want to be in their country either. And so,
Okay. The Taliban's country. Okay. Okay. In some sense. Okay. Okay.
Right. So they understand that they have a very strong interest in making sure that there isn't another mass casualty attack from Afghanistan. I genuinely believe that they do not want another attack to happen. Now, I listen to some of the more hawkish think tanks, like I listen to all the think tanks, but if you listen to, for example, Foundation for Defense of Democracy, one of the more hawkish think tanks, and probably their biggest point that they like to emphasize is that the Taliban has not severed relations with Al-Qaeda. And it's interesting that that's their main point because nobody really argues otherwise. It's not as if the Doves are saying, no, the Taliban, has totally severed relations with Al-Qaeda. There's no interoperability. There's no intermarriages with the Haqqanis. It's not like, the networks aren't intertwined. That's not actually what Doves say. Restrainers are more likely to have faith, or at least to have hope that deterrence will work. I think that there's a difference between the Taliban not formally severing ties with Al-Qaeda and Afghanistan turning into a staging ground for all sorts of mass casualty attacks like 9/11. The reality is that, and the Biden administration has pointed this out correctly, is that the rest of the world is not Al-Qaeda free. And yet we do not go occupy these other areas. I think that many Americans, including some of the listeners here today who will probably be more savvy when it comes to IR than the general public, they might be surprised to know that in Idlib province in Syria, was the largest gathering of Al-Qaeda fighters in the world, far larger than in Afghanistan. And yet the US, at least according to our national security advisor, sided with that side. The anti-Assad resistance, which was certainly interlaced with Al-Qaeda. And so I want to reject this idea that we need to occupy areas wherever there might be an Al-Qaeda presence. I just wrote a paper on the spread of jihadism, Al-Qaeda and ISIS and their various affiliates throughout Africa. And you don't see a big movement for the United States to occupy, say, Mozambique or the Sahel or the Horn of Africa. And if anything, it seems that we've been moving away from those areas. So I do think that there's a strong incentive for the Taliban to keep at bay transnational terrorists. At the same time, I do think that frankly, there will be terrorists. There will be terrorists in Afghanistan. And honestly, the number of terrorists may well increase. But whether they mount an attack against the United States, that's a very different question.
Okay. Could I just ask specifically about those 5,000 Taliban prisoners that were released as part of the deal in 2020, and which many Afghans felt to be a betrayal. The Afghan government did not want to comply with it, but they did in the end. And quite a few of them went back to fighting. We know that some of them became major commanders. To what extent do you think that contributed to the Taliban win on the battlefield?
Well, I have a kind of a weird view about all sorts of issues in IR, including what to do with Afghanistan. Most people who favored withdrawing from Afghanistan, the so-called restrainers or whatever, they were in favor of negotiations. I actually wasn't. I've been in favor. I agree with 99% of what the restrainers have to say. I was in favor of getting out of Afghanistan. I'm opposed to nation building. I don't think it's a good investment at all to try to determine the internal political systems of foreign countries, particularly ones that we don't understand and ones where we don't have very much agency. But at the same time, I haven't been in favor of negotiation with the Taliban. I haven't supported the Doha agreements. I've seen a lot of problems with there. I think many of the criticisms there are justified. I think that today, all the little sort of sub-negotiations with the Taliban in terms of allowing American citizens and our allies in Afghanistan to leave their country, all these discussions with the Taliban, it's very unfortunate. And I do think that it's due to a lack of planning. I think that we should have assumed that the Taliban wasn't going to help us. They're not our friends. And we should have taken proactive actions for us to extricate ourselves from this conflict without assuming any kind of trust with this organization, which certainly doesn't deserve it. So I wouldn't have been in favor of, negotiating the release of Taliban fighters or inviting any of them to Camp David the way it was talked about under the Trump administration. And the reason why, let me just finally square the circle if it's not totally obvious, and that's because I do believe in deterrence. I do believe, again, that the Taliban has an interest of us getting out of their country. And I think that we should have said, okay, we're going to leave. We do not want to be in your country. But please understand, if there's another attack like there is on 9/11, we are coming back. Now, some people say, why would the Taliban care? They defeated us after 20 years. I don't think that that's actually a strong argument. We were there for 20 years. They didn't want us there. And furthermore, there are different gradations of how much pain we could inflict. The truth is that we treated ISIS very differently than we treated the Taliban. If there was a mass casualty attack like 9/11, we could throw down a world of pain on the Taliban. And that is just a fact. We don't want to do that. They don't want to do that. And because of this convergence of interest, that created an opportunity for us to get out of that country in a smooth way without these kinds of negotiations, which in many cases could be counterproductive, as your question indicated, and in others, they're simply embarrassing.
Okay, so you're saying, the initial question was, to what extent did these 5,000 prisoners contribute to the battle and actually help the Taliban to defeat the government forces?
Right, well, the 1 week period where the Taliban steamrolled against the country, they didn't do that by outfighting the Afghan military. It was remarkably quick and remarkably bloodless. So it's not as if it was like a really close fight, and then because of this additional 5,000 fighters, somehow the Taliban was able to surprise estimates in terms of the balance of power. So it probably wasn't actually consequential to the conquest, but it's a good example of why the United States doesn't want to get involved in the weeds there. And what we really want to do is just get the hell out of this country.
Got it. I would like to ask Nipa a question. Now, we've spoken a lot about what the men are doing, basically. Men in government, men as terrorists, men as fighters. You worked in the country extensively in development. Now, how do you see the role of women changing after the win of the Taliban? Do you think that they will continue to have some of the rights that you saw that Canada and other countries, the US clearly also helped to advance in some way, or will they all be lost?
Well, I think that that some of the achievements that has been there, that will continue. The Taliban have said, and over again, which is not often referred to by speakers, is that they would have the education of women intact, and so that is there, and also they will allow women to work. Although they said that they cannot become president, I don't think that's needed right now. However, that these two promises are there, and I believe that would continue. And I think that I have worked in development for about 35 years in different countries, and in fact, mostly Islam, in countries where Muslim are the majority. And I have seen these work. When I look at Bangladesh, which is also an Islamic state, there are these two rights, education and also income for women, they were the two areas that were emphasized, and women in Bangladesh really have been equal with the men, I would say. I mean, gender equality we talk about, even in the West, we have differentiations anyway. But in what I see in Bangladesh is really great improvement. And not only improvement, I think that they couldn't have done better. They have reached all the targets that have been set for the Millennium Development Goals, better than any countries, best in South Asia, better than India. And these two things would earn the women without rocking the boat too much. I mean, screaming about feminism is not something that eventually is successful, because that creates problems and disturbances. However, education, community schools, and also work. In Bangladesh, they work in male professions, but gradually, what could start is like home cottage industries, women working in tailoring, in embroidery, and those are sold so that they get the income. And also, they have got fruits and they can make jams and jellies. That had been done in India, very successful cottage industry, and that could be done. So I'm saying that it's not feminism, but it's really equality for women that is important. By the way, the earning of an income is so important because it gives women confidence. They earn a dignity and support of the family, and even the communities are very pleased if it happens, and it would happen with the Taliban as well. By the way, I just want to mention one thing, that Ahmad Shah Massoud has made well, it's not Ahmad Shah Massoud, but it's his son who is there, who has taken over the Panjshir Valley anti-Taliban resistance movement leadership. He says that they are willing to defend the last stronghold, which is the Panjshir Valley. However, he has strongly emphasized the need for negotiation and a political settlement. That gave me hope. I really don't think withdrawal is going to stop. I'm a development person, so I'm talking from the point of view of common Afghans, not what the Western people think, and others who don't get the brunt of a brutal regime. It's the common Afghans that decide. What I see in them, that they want to get out at this time, but they are saying that there needs to be a negotiated settlement. These are, I would say, educated people, but they are saying this. And I don't see any other way. If you want good for the Afghans, I'm not talking about the government, I'm not talking about the Taliban, the benefits should come to the people of Afghanistan. And for that, you need a political settlement.
Okay, great. Could Nila Far speak a little bit about that? I mean, clearly women are at least half the population there, and I believe that they are most likely the ones that are the most scared at the moment and the least likely to find a way out of the country. I mean, clearly most of them will not get a special immigrant visa. They have not worked with any of the forces. They are the least educated. Could you speak a little bit about what you see in the future of women in Afghanistan?
Sure, I'll get back to your question. Let me a little bit highlight about the total disengagement of United States and international community with Afghanistan and what consequences it might have. I wrote a paper a few months back and predicting the situation and how that could further add into the global security, or global insecurity. I mean, if the United States and the international community completely disengage with Afghanistan moving forward, as Nipa mentioned, yeah, one of the ways moving forward is, which I also hear a lot from Afghans inside Afghanistan, is a settlement. An inclusive government, a settlement, and that has to have a push from outside. And of course, the inside, they are already doing a lot in order to make that. I hope Taliban and the other factions, political factions, will come to an agreement in making an inclusive government. So now look, Afghanistan is a poor country, right? We all know. It's ripe for radicalization. It's ripe for terrorist networks to emerge, to build their alliances, to be a threat for global peace, right? For be a threat to the United States security. And that is a fair, because when the country is so ripe for radicalization and it has further paving ways for terrorists to emerge, yes, for the short term, we might not see the consequences, but if it's not tackled well, I think for the long term, we might see a very serious security, we means here in the United States, we might see a serious security threat from Afghanistan emerge. Therefore, yes, I agree with Max saying that, but partly agree, because yeah, for the short term, we might not see that consequence that would threat our security here in the United States. But for the long term, we might see that if it's not tackled well. So now how to tackle it? The tacklement is to be engaged, right? That level of engagement should be there. Yes, over the horizon options were there. Let's keep that and see how things will go on. But on the other level, there should be engagement as well. And as already, there has been some commitment to further engage in order to protect some of the institutional gains or whatever, which has been placed from last 20 years. That has been a commitment from administration here, that they will be with Afghans and they remain, the United States will remain committed. I think that commitment at this point is needed, because that will prevent the country to prepare itself for another safe space, for a new version of terrorist group to emerge. And remember, in Afghanistan, historically, if we see rebel change to different forms of terrorist groups from 1918 or 80 onwards. So there's an evolution of terrorists, but their names and the formation. But again, there is a risk. There's a high risk currently in the country, knowing the fact that it is there's a lot of regional neighbor meddling, knowing the fact that it's extremely poor, and knowing the fact that it's ripe for radicalization. So these three factors make it ripe and make the opportunities for the terrorist groups to emerge, to consolidate themselves, and to be a threat to us here, or to the international peace that we are right now making a case that, well, Afghanistan cannot be that threat again. I think I would have a counter argument that if it's not tackled well, Afghanistan will be will have another phase of this terrorist to emerge and be a serious security threat to the interests of global power. So that is why, yes, the engagement is important. The commitment of this engagement is important, and as Max mentioned, trusting a group like Taliban, a militant group like Taliban, that is not wise moving forward. And by trusting, I mean that Taliban will have three phases now. One is the consolidating phase, which is it's a consolidation of power, which this is the phase right now they're going on. The second is a transition phase. And the third will be the establishment phase. And the establishment phase will be the establishment of emirate, right? So during these three phases, they will show good pictures of them, right? They will demonstrate that they have changed, right? They will demonstrate that they have reformed, and now their treatment with the population in large, they might do a little bit good with the governance, with security, with population in large, particularly with women, since that has been an international focus from last 20 years even. They will actually be flexible during these three phases in order to gain international recognition. But once they get the recognition, that could be problematic, right? To argue for those gains. So what I would see that trusting a militant group who already people have experience, all internationals, the United States and Afghans, they have experience with them from 1996 to 2001. And they know how they governed. They know how they treated the population in large. They know even their relationship with the international community. So trusting them at this stage will be a total mistake. Wait and see, one option. The second is whatever recognition is given to them moving forward whenever the time comes. I think that should be conditional. That should be time locked. I mean, knowing the nature of the militant groups overall in the world and knowing the performance of Taliban in the past, I think it should be conditional plus time locked. That makes a lot of sense moving forward. But again, trusting them would be a mistake at this particular time.
This question of trust, I think, is important. I do think that we should trust the Taliban, but only trust them in terms of doing what they think will serve the Taliban. We shouldn't, we shouldn't trust that they're going to, help women because they care about women, that they're going to help Americans because, it's consistent with their norms. They will do what's strategic. There's plenty of reason, and I wouldn't say that about all militant groups. The Taliban does a lot of very strategic stuff that some other groups do not do. So I do think that they have learned, and that will affect their subsequent behavior. I just want to add one point also about when we withdraw, what will the effect be on the terrorism threat? I've seen a number of prominent terrorism academics be, very pessimistic about this withdrawal by saying it's just like Iraq. The historical lesson of Iraq, of course, was that we got out of there and then shortly after ISIS sprouted. But I want, and I don't want to say that that could not happen in Afghanistan, but I would like to point out that there are many other countries which had a terrorism threat or some kind of militancy threat, however you define it, and we left, but then there wasn't a subsequent attack against Americans. An example could be Somalia, or maybe a better example would be out of southern Lebanon with Hezbollah. It's not as if Hezbollah then chased us by authorizing, mass casualty attacks against the U.S. homeland. So there's really a mixed empirical picture about what happens when Americans withdraw from conflict zones. And it's not entirely clear that the Iraq case is the most predictive analogy, but we'll have to wait and see.
Okay, great.
And one thing, Shelley, that you asked me about women groups, I've been receiving calls, by the way, where Taliban entered the women organization, and they technically very clearly said that women should not come to those local NGOs. And then they also entered in a couple of universities, by the way, in the provinces. I'm talking about provinces, that they stopped women to come and teach, and also stopped women, girls, students to come to university. So there are cases that we see that they already have, and it seems there are kind of a fragmentation between Taliban in Kabul and Taliban in the provinces, So they demonstrate something at a Kabul level that provinces, we hear different things, where women are actually being stopped, being prevented from work, and they have treated women even on the roads in a different way, that where is your escort with you while you are alone. So there are serious cases even reported from the provincial level that shows Taliban still haven't changed, right? And now last 20 years have brought certainly lots of changes. Therefore, women education, women right to work, and women right to be in politics. This should be negotiated moving forward with any government taking shape in future. Thank you.
Yeah, and I wanted to just add to that. I mean, for those of us in the West who fully appreciate gender equality, I think we have a lot of hard work to do in terms of promoting social change in places particularly outside of the West. And we have our own issues, obviously, but I think that the role of NGOs, of civil society groups, is going to be hard work in places like Afghanistan, but it'll be more sustainable and ideally when it does happen. And so I think that I think this is not a call for us in the West not to care about the plight of women in Afghanistan, but it is a call for, I think, doing a lot of the hard work that's going to have to take place in terms of social change, and that that can be a separate issue from the issue of whether the United States needs to be in Afghanistan for its security needs or its national interests more broadly, because I would argue that the United States government is not meant to be, by its proper role, an agent of social change around the world. It could be an exemplar of our democratic and liberal system, but it's not well suited to be someone that can lead to long-term sustainable change in norms and mores and modes of life. That's going to just take a lot longer. And I think one of the conceits of our last 20 years has been this notion that we could easily and quickly change the culture of a place. And I think that is ultimately a fool's errand. And we just have to have some sense that there are real constraints on our ability to get what we want in the world. And hard work achieving hard things takes hard work. And I hope to see NGOs facilitate changes in the nature of Afghanistan, but we also shouldn't be, think that that's going to happen quickly or without contestation.
I was thinking, I agree about having social change. They don't come very fast. The changes that I was talking about in Bangladesh, maybe it took 50 years to have that. However, it is the local NGOs that have taken lead in those in getting those changes. It's not done by Western NGOs either. They're done by local NGOs. It's a very, very well-reputed NGO, BRAC, that was also in Afghanistan. They worked towards these kind of changes that is necessary. And as I said, it's not that these should not be introduced as Western concepts, but they should be introduced for the sake of women, what benefits it's bringing. Our objective is also to assist women to achieve independence and a place in the society. But that needs to be done in a country like Afghanistan in a very low profile fashion, so that it doesn't raise the concerns of the people, it doesn't rock the boat and the society. And that is best done by local NGOs. BRAC is an NGO that is absolutely excellent. It takes many, many years for a country to get to that stage, but it can be done. It's a long time job, yes. Just talking about, feminist viewpoints will not help.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, I've been told that we need to end the discussion. We haven't been able to take audience questions because it's been such a lively discussion between the panelists. Thank you all so much for coming. I've just been asked to say, yes, please subscribe to our channel on YouTube, of course, to view the recording of this panel and other discussions that IPD has organized. And that's it. Thank you guys so much.